This is the story of my father, George Parker, who settled in British Columbia, the central part of British Columbia, in 1912, and the pioneer experience he went through. One thing that struck me as I was researching some of this, how similar my dad's experience in 1912 in the central part of British Columbia would be with the pioneers that came out here in 1850, which would have been about only 60 years difference in time, but it was almost identical experiences, except we didn't have any, up in Canada, they didn't have any roads at all. It was just walking in by Indian Trail, and there were a lot fewer people. For the first 5 years, I would imagine the same amount of people would be about the same as one wagon train that came out here in the 1850s. So this is apparently a French map, because those words aren't familiar to me. Some of them are French, I can see. But up at the top there, it says 5450. And actually, it should be 5440, but who am I to criticize? But anyway, this whole area from the bottom line down here to the top line was subject to the argument between Britain and the U.S. on who owned that land. Now, in the eastern part of Canada, after the War of 1812, they settled on the 49th parallel that went out to the Rocky Mountains. But from the Rocky Mountains west, it was unsettled. So Canada, of course, wanted it down here to Mexico, which would have been that 42 parallel. And the Americans wanted it up there at 5440. And during that time, a guy by the name of James Pope was running for president, and his big thing is 5440 or fight. You know, he had a lot of Donald Trump in him, and he was really adamant about, he didn't talk about fences, I don't think, but anyway, it hadn't been too long since the War of 1812, and some people could even, older people could even remember the Revolutionary War. And they were tired of fighting, so they thought, well, maybe we better compromise and figure this out. So logically, what they did is just extended the line on to the west on the 49th parallel. Canada did get all of Vancouver Island. You can see down over there in the corner, part of that is below the 49th parallel. So that's a little bit of history. Now, these were the maps that, well, I should say after Canada became, of course, it was part of England in those days, but after the line was established, then the Canadian government and the English said, I wonder what we have up there. You know, hardly anybody had been up in that part of British Columbia. So they sent explorers up there to see what the country actually looked like, to see if it might be suitable for homesteading and see what the Indian situation was. And so in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of explorers went into that area. And this is a map of what they found. Now, this map is not very accurate. And actually, this lake here and this lake here run into one another. So you can see there's about a 40-mile discrepancy there in that map. But and we've had speakers here that talked about the old maps, remember, where they thought that Baja California was an island rather than connected to the mainland and things like that. So anyway, this is, and the explorers, what they did is they took a lot of notes and they tried to find out what the land looked like. These are just like, this is May 5th, 1910, they were in that area up there, and they were over here on May 26, 1910, and they were down here and so forth. And if you probably can't read it, but it says good grazing land and good grazing over here, poplar woods up there. So anyway, they were trying to get an idea of what they had, like I say, and for homesteading. And these were the original map, which is now pretty accurate, and the part we're talking about is Utsa Lake. This is Utsa Lake here. And this is Cheslata Lake, the Indians, where the Indians were. And we'll talk about that some too. But and the other thing that you probably can't tell, and I can barely see, is so anyway, the Indians were over here on Cheslata Lake. And that was, and the dark areas are those areas that hadn't been chosen to be homesteaded on. So now my dad enters into the picture, and he and a friend of his in Grants Pass, well, first of all, he was born in Florida, and at the age of 2, the family moved out to Grants Pass. So he lived there through high school and through grade school, of course, and then high school. And then we think he worked for about a year, and then he went to Oregon State, Oregon Agricultural College, OAC, Oregon Agricultural College, in 1911 for 1 year. And when he was in high school, he and his friend Roswell from Grants Pass had been talking about wanting to go into British Columbia, and they'd been reading this book, and I want to read a little bit about it, that these explorers I mentioned had written about that country. And it isn't completely accurate, but it would make you think that this was something that you wanted to go to. Well, this is going to be really hard to read. Anyway, I better just explain it. Basically, it said that those people with limited means and very little outdoor experience would have a big problem. But he said those that had some money, after 2 or 3 years, there would be adequate roads and markets for produce, you know. Well, when I read this to the group in Canada, our neighbors, at our 100th anniversary in 2012, they really laughed at that, because even yet they don't have any markets or any roads. So there's quite a bit of exaggeration there. But we'll talk about these Indians in a minute. They were on Cheslata Lake. This is Batiste family. There were 2 brothers primarily. This is the Batiste family, and they were all related. And you can see that now the government probably built that building for them back there. It's kind of a community building. Most of them still lived in tents at that time. And they were much like the Indians here. In the wintertime, they would go back to their encampments, and in the summer, they would just roam around, and they would sleep wherever they were, ended up with tents, looking for berries, looking for fish, and of course, they had a lot of fish on their own little lake. But these pictures are kind of interesting. They were taken this one in 1910, October 1910. This is Chief Louis, and he was the gentleman on the left there was a good friend of my dad's. He was the chief of this particular little band of Indians. Here they are going probably on a trip. They don't have packs with them, so they're probably just going on a fishing trip, or, well, it wouldn't be fishing in the winter, trapping probably. This is interesting, these 2 little girls. These are Chief Louis' daughters. And look at the size of the hands on those kids. And the other thing I noticed, the one on the left apparently has lost her arm. There's no hand over there, and it looks like her blouse is just hanging loose. But they did have problems with health and accidents and so forth, so that very likely could be what happened to her. They did have a church. There was a priest by the name of Father Maurice that went through all that country, made maps, and primarily went in to save the Indians spiritually, but he also did a great job of exploring different areas and reporting on it. Now this is kind of a sad situation where their cemetery got flooded out, and I'll get to the reason why after a while, but they found about, in the 50s, they found about remains of about 60 of their tribe, which they took out of the water and made new, this isn't where they actually buried them, this would be over the graves. Now we'll get into the settlers. This is Roswell here, and this cabin was built in 1913, and they had come up he and his parents had come up in 1910, so they were actually there before my dad. But my dad lived with them for 1 year, 1912, and then he built his own cabin. But I should backtrack a little bit. They came over, I don't know how familiar you are with grease trails. You've probably heard that term, but the smelt oil was a highly, a commodity that everybody cherished. And the Indians from the interior would come to the coast over these trails to bring back the smelt oil. And they used it for medical purposes, and also like you would use butter or cooking or whatever, but that was a highly wanted commodity. So the interior Indians would take berries and fried berries and so forth, berries and other things to the coast, and then they would haul this back. So they were hauling what they used the term grease. Now, the Bella Coola Trail, where my dad came in on, was one of these grease trails. It was about 170 miles, and it took them about 2 weeks of walking. And they all walked because they needed the pack horses, and there were about 10 to a group, to pack all the belongings that they brought in. It cost them about 5 cents a pound for all their, whatever they brought, their food and, you know, the flour. And if you've been over to the Washington County Museum, you can see what they brought out with the wagon trains. This would be about the same type of commodities that they took up there. So anyway, getting back to the pioneers, this is Roswell. He came up in 1910. And my dad's first building had long since been torn down. They kind of tore down their buildings if they weren't going to use them anymore to keep the cattle from going in, or the moose and whatever getting stuck in the building and starving to death. And that happened 2 or 3 different times. So normally if they were done with the building and the logs were in much use, they'd just destroy them. So this was where my dad's first cabin stood, and it's out in the woods. This is kind of interesting. This, I don't think you can read the top, but it's a 1913 calendar that my dad had made up. And it's like a typical calendar. There's January, February, March, April, May, June. And, you know, after a few days, they had no idea just what day it was, you know, unless they kept track of it, because there was absolutely no communications, no radios, obviously no telephones or anything like that. So they got all their news when the next batch of pioneers would come in from Bella Coola or on the coast. So I found this in the upstairs attic of the old house, and I treasure this. I have it on my wall in Canada, but for whatever reason, either he lost track of the days himself, he quit marking them off down in here in May. So, but I thought that was really neat to find that, because that's the first evidence I have of my dad being up there, even though, of course, we knew he was. He in some of these diaries are over here if you want to look at them. He was pretty good about writing diaries, which surprised me because he was single and he really didn't have much hope of getting married and having a family, because there were only 2 other married women in that whole area, and they're all bachelors, the rest of them. But anyway, he kept some good diaries. of the 30-some years that he lived up there, probably it covers about 10 years. However, there were none of them the first 10 years or so, which I regret, or if he did write them, we lost them through the years. But this is his first cabin, and it's still there. And you can notice it doesn't have a typical roof on it. It just has slanted roof there. And that was the way they did it. It has a double roof, and there would probably be moss or sod in between. And they build them really small because it gets really cold in the wintertime, and the smaller, of course, the easier it is to heat. And so he had that, and then this would have been in about 1914, I guess. No, he was in that other cabin for about 10 years. This would have been about 1924. This is the same cabin, but you see how he's finished it. And here he is. Now there's another building behind it over here on the left that he never finished. I think we moved to a different location, so I think he had planned for us to live there, but then moved on. So anyway, this was my dad when he was probably about 38. He was born in 1890, so it was probably about 1938, I would guess. This is really an interesting cabin, and we take usually visitors that come up to see us or whatever, we take them out. This is Frenchie's cabin, and he was an artist with a broadaxe, and you can see how he squared all those logs, and that thing is just as solid. As near as we can tell, he built it in about 1929, and if it had windows, and the roof is kind of demolished, but you could still live in it. I mean, it's remarkable how solid that wood is after all those years. And it's right out in the middle of the woods. The interesting thing is, the first time we found it, we had to wander around about an hour or so with a friend of ours that knew where it was, but he couldn't find it either. It was right in the spruce trees, and you just, all of a sudden, you're on a house out there, and it's really amazing experience. Anyway, we see it. This is Kentucky Bill, who you might wonder where he came from. Kentucky Bill, interesting, my mother said he couldn't even sign his name, but I think he must have been able to sign his name. But my dad did all these correspondence and so forth. He couldn't write anyway. He might be able to read a little bit, but he was a really neat guy, though, and he lived there for a number of years. And I think that's my dad kneeling over on the left, and my aunt in the center, who came up in the late 1920s. This is the way they did a portage of their canoes from one lake to another, where they had to go over land. And now these weren't our neighbors. This was even earlier, in 1910, it said. So this is the way they moved there, and you can see that they have a pack saddle. That's a pack saddle there, rather than a riding saddle. But and there must have been a wheel down on the other end, of course. And there's my dad with his boat. I think he was trying to impress my future mother, because, and I'll tell the rest of the story, but anyway, he had a bunch of pictures taken about that time, 1928 it would have been, which he sent down. But now I want to read a little bit. How we doing time-wise? Pretty good? Another 20 minutes, okay? Okay. Those diaries are a little bit hard to read, and they faded out quite a bit, so I just took a few passages from it here. We'll read to you. These were the early years to give you an idea of their lifestyle. First one, this is December of 1923. Went down to Harrison's. That was their nearest neighbor, about 2 miles away. Went down to Harrison in the afternoon. The hoodoo, which was a term I didn't know, and I still haven't figured out exactly. I hadn't heard it before. The hoodoo was there. A pack train of 17 horses came down from the store going home to El Chaco, and that was along the Bella Coola Trail, this little. So a hoodoo apparently is a group, a bunch of horses, or maybe that's the Indian team. But anyway, I didn't understand that. December 26th, there are millions of rabbits this year, I think more than 1912, 13, 14. And then later on, got 50 pounds of carrots from Birkin at another neighbor for $1. Stayed home, cut wood, baked 3 pies. That would be hard to figure out what he used for pie. Pardon?
He's your father?
Yeah. Oh, I get you. Yeah. This would have been 1923. Francis Lake did not freeze over last winter. It is said that the last time it did not freeze was 1870. Francis Lake is a lake that we have to go across coming from Burns Lake, which is a major town of about 6,000 people, out to our area, which is called the South, what do they call it? The word they use, South Bank, and anyway, the South Country. So that's the lake he was talking about there. The Henson boys were staying at Todd's cabin and trapping on my trap grounds. So I don't know what he did about that, but that was kind of illegal. On May 10th, 12th, he says, headed to Utsa Lake 12 years ago, half soled my shoes. Leaves came out on the poplars today. We are sending Mrs. Bennett to Fort Fraser to the Liberal Convention. And then on May 20th, went to Utsa and voted for Manson and against beer. He didn't like beer. See, he didn't like hops either. So they did have elections, and they were really pretty political. I'll show a picture later of the road work they did, and my dad was the foreman most of the time because he was a liberal, and when the liberals were in power, then the foreman had to be a liberal too. Isn't that something? Way up there and then if he got voted out, if the Liberal Party got voted out, the Conservatives, then another guy by the name of Vandekar would be the foreman. So they traded back and forth through about 30 years. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of that. Went to the dumping ground place to see if there's any hay on the grass, or see as any hay, as the grasshoppers have eaten most of mine here at home. The dumping ground place was 3 miles from this original cabin that I just showed, and that's where we moved in 1940. So that's where I went to grade school, at the second cabin, and that was on section 443. Dug up the potatoes at the Raymond place. There was a fine crop. 40 pounds of seed yield about 600 pounds of potatoes. They were big on eating potatoes, and their diet was terrible, you know. They weren't all that interested in vegetables, I guess, anyway, but they would, you could get carrots would keep over, and potatoes would keep over, and after the first few years, they all were able to kill a moose or two every year, so that's what they lived on. This is interesting. Let's see. I went down to Harrison's hauling wood. When I got home, the Indians here, before that, I got to tell you, a Siwash. Now, they call the Indians, which is a pretty negative term, Siwashes. Siwash. That's not quite as bad as the N word, but getting close. So if things were going kind of bad, they called them Siwashes. Otherwise, they called them Indians. But in this case, he says, a Siwash came to get some hay. After he loaded up, he wanted it on jawbone, so I unloaded it. By jawbone, that meant just promising, wagging his jaws, meaning maybe I'll pay you later. So he unloaded it. And then 2 days later, March 5th, this was March 3rd. Then on March 5th, he went down to Harrison's to haul wood. When I got home, the Indian was here, had been here, and took the hay. So the Indian got even after all. And I don't suppose they did. That was kind of, unfortunately, what happened. The Indians kind of lived that way, and they didn't think much wrong about lifting something from somebody else. My dad had his traps sprung quite a few times and fur taken out of his traps and whatever, and you just kind of had to live with it, So those were Siwashes that did that. I went back with Birkin to his place, got 4 dozen eggs and 4 pounds of butter. Eggs, 25 cents a dozen. Butter, 35 cents a pound. Cut hay. Horses ran away on the rake and hurt my back some. Laid down first round of the new cabin, 14 by 16 inside. So that was about the dimensions of those cabins, 14 by 16. So that would be like 200 square feet. So if you want to compare that to your house, it's pretty small. Yeah. So anyway, those were kind of the way the first years were. And there were two years, we think maybe 3, that he went over to the prairie provinces. They would have thrashing crews that would come up from Texas all the way up into Alberta for the wheat harvest. And he would go over there. Interesting thing, in spite of the fact they didn't have any roads still out at Oots Lake at all in our area, the train went through Burns Lake. So I wondered, until I learned that the train came in 1914, that must have been how he got over to the prairie provinces. I thought, gosh, he couldn't have walked over there or ridden his horse, because that'd be maybe 1,000 miles away. So anyway, he went over there for a couple of years during the summer. And other than that, he spent a lot of the year clearing land, building fence. He started to get some cattle and started to get that going. So in 1928, his parents had a 50th wedding anniversary. So he was the only boy. There were 8 kids, and he was the only boy left. The one youngest boy was killed in the First World War in France. The second boy, or the oldest, just flat disappeared, and they never saw him for about 40 years. And then he finally came back in 1950 into the family. But anyway, so my dad was the only boy, and there were 5 girls. So they wanted him to come back for sure for the 50th wedding anniversary. And he didn't really care that much for leaving, I don't think, except that maybe it was the cost of the getting home and all that. But because he hadn't seen his family at that time for 17 years, none of them. And they would write him letters and send him the Oregonian. He loved to read, so he had all kinds of reading material, which mainly was sent from his sisters. And his mother, she was still alive until 1930. So anyway, it came down to his parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And there he is with 3 of his sisters. 2 of them lived in Portland at that time, and one was in Hawaii teaching school, one was somewhere else. And I imagine that was the first and only time he ever wore a suit, but there he was in 1928. But when he was there, this lady by the name of Marguerite Scott was a good friend of the family. And actually, she taught school in Medford. Bill Bowerman happened to be one of her students she always talked about. Anyway, she taught high school in Medford, and she would go over to Grants Pass to my grandparents' place where his sister lived. This one on the right lived there all the time. And she was teaching school too. So anyway, they were really acquainted with Marguerite. And so my dad was just there a month, so he got pretty well acquainted apparently with her too, and liked her, and she liked him. And so he went back home to his farm and ranch, and doggone, they corresponded for a whole year, and darned if she didn't, or he didn't propose by mail, and she accepted by mail. There weren't any telephones, so they couldn't talk, so they had to write out what they wanted to say, I guess. And in fact, she kept all those letters and then destroyed them and cut them into little bitty pieces. And so we never, my niece tried to take it apart and put them all back together to see what they were saying, but she couldn't do it. So we still, my niece has the little cushion that she made with all those letters. But my mother came up there by train in 1929, that would have been, and that's their wedding certificate. It's really neat. It's got passages from the Bible up there on top, and it mentions their name and where they were from and who stood up for them. She got into Burns Lake in the middle of the night and wandered around town until the preacher was available, and they got married. Like I say, I hadn't seen one another for over a year, and got married within an hour when they got there. Well, it was a little later than that because she got in the middle of the night. Let's give her 10 hours maybe. So, but here she is, and there's the cabin. At that time, it didn't have a porch on it, and I want to read a little bit about her experience coming up, if I can see this time. This is a little bigger print. I'll get over here. On June 30th, this is after she got to Burns Lake. No, up here. Start up above. I arrived on the Canadian National Railroad from Prince Rupert to Burns Lake at 2 a.m. George met me. Being very close to the longest day of the year, it was breaking day when the train pulled in. After breakfast the next morning, George and I walked around Burns Lake, which didn't take long. There were probably about 200 people total. And near noon, we went to the United Church minister's home, who was a bachelor. He'd been somewhere else to a wedding in the morning, and then he performed the ceremony about 1 o'clock. I'm skipping some here. On June 30th, George had Charlie Henson take us with all my belongings to Harrison's Bay. Harrison's Bay was about 2 miles from our house, and it was the nearest neighbor. But Mrs. Harrison was a wonderful lady, according to my mother, and that was her best friend for a number of years. She goes on to say, I met Jim and Mrs. Harrison. I don't even know her first name. Even her husband called her Mrs. Harrison. If there ever was a real lady, she was the one. She was kind, friendly, and so forth. She did inside, okay. I was green from the city and never would have known the ways of the frontier if it had not been for Mrs. Harrison, who taught me how to make sourdough, corn moose meat, canned vegetable, in water baths, in a big wash tub, and dozens of other things that were all new to me. From Harrison's, this is the day after they were married, George and I walked to our home, lot 497, about 2 miles from Harrison's Bay. So here they walked home carrying a suitcase 2 miles to see their house, which was his. So I've often wondered what my mother would have thought, because she'd been a school teacher and had her car, and telephone and the whole bit, whatever they had in Grants Pass or in Medford. So she went on to say Mrs. Harrison was the only lady nearer than the 6 ladies at the settlement, which was 12 miles away, and Mrs. Henson at the other end of Utsa Lake, which was another 12. So 12 miles today, you know, we wouldn't think anything of it, but 12 miles if you're afoot or horseback is 4 hours at least, maybe 5 hours. So if you were going to visit somebody, it would be an all-day experience, you know, even if they were only 12 miles away. So they didn't travel too much unless they had a whole day to kill. So anyway, I want to go through some more family-type pictures. This is my granddad. He looks pretty stern, doesn't he? And what tickles me is this is a suit and an overcoat, as you can see, and it was out there in that remote area. People just dressed up to get their picture taken, I guess. And that's my aunt, the same aunt that you saw a previous picture of in the center. And going back, I'm sure my dad has on a set of coveralls with a tie, which is, and my mother, I guess that would have been the dresses people wore in 1929. Here they were going to see the neighbors. This is our mode of transportation, except unless we were on a saddle horse. And this particular time, this didn't even have seats in it, so it was a kind of a dual purpose. You could haul hay in it, or you could haul people in it, or whatever. But we never had a car in all the time we were up there. I don't think I was ever in a car except one time. The neighbor did have an old beat-up truck. I remember it broke down too on our way up to Utsa Lake, and that's the only time in my first 10 years of life that I was ever in a car. There I am with my sister. I love that picture. And that's the same house, except you can see she had curtains up and so forth. She made it, and she had flower beds all around the cabin, so it was comfortable. But my sister had been born in 1930, and I was born in 1934. So I would have probably been about 1 in that picture. Here we are a little later around her flowers, and I guess I was pretending to hold something, and my sister had a doll there. This is my dad's trap line, and there's a lake there named after him, and this mentions the dimensions of the trap line. It was about 17 miles around it, and it says passing Todd and Parker Lake, thence north to Square Lake, and up said lake to Big Point, so forth. So there was about 11 lakes on this trap line. This was my dad's trap line, this area here. He had the biggest one around. Although the Indians had this trap line across the lake. This is Utsa Lake here. The Indians had that trap line, and this was also an Indian trap line. These were all white people in here: George Brown, Parker, E.B. Nichols, all friends of my dad, Jack Roy, so forth. That was 1931. You also got your hunting license along. This is a team of 6 horses pulling a grader. This is where they graded the road. That was, I may have mentioned, one of the few employment opportunities during those early years. And the foreman got paid $380 a day and got to supply the team of horses. And the other workers were $320 a day. So you did do a little better if you were the foreman. Like I say, my dad was foreman most of the time. But these were just expanded Indian trails that they were working on. This is a root cellar, and that was a real vital thing for pioneers to have, because that's where they stored all their produce, their potatoes and their rutabagas and their onions and all that, as well as canned goods. And those things kept the temperature pretty consistent, summer or winter. And everybody had a root cellar. Nobody had electricity in that area till about 1972, I think it was. So they were still living with gas lighters and so forth. This is our second cabin, and this is where I went to school. And this is a root cellar on that property right there. It had caved in. This one had caved in. But so that's where my sister and I, 4 of the neighbor kids, and my mother and my dad would, of course, I'm sure, vacate the premises with all that kids' noise and everything. Anyway, I don't know how we ever fit in that house, but there's another view of it from the hill. Our garden was up here on the right-hand side, up on top of the hill. And you wonder why it was so far from the house, but on an upslope like that, there's enough air circulation that the temperature's a couple of degrees warmer than it would be down in this, what they call a frost pocket. So you could plant your garden a little earlier and can more depend on not having it frost. The days are, you know, in the summertime up there, the days are really long. It's light at 4 in the morning and it's dark at 10 or 10:30 at night. Well, it isn't really even dark, but it's, you know, dusk. So things grow remarkably well in that short period of time. So especially root crops. We did a little fun things too. This is Kentucky Bill. He spent most of his time hunting and fishing. And this is my Aunt Alma. She came up from Kansas, this lady on the right, my mother's aunt. And there I am, hunched over there, and my sister and my dad. My mother obviously took the picture. This would have been about 1940. So I would have been about 6 years old then. Here's kind of a family get-together. My dad's leaning against a tree in the back. My mother's down below there. This guy here was a remarkable guy. He was kind of the hero of the area for being the best trapper in the country. Charlie Lindquist. He was a Swede. There were mostly my dad and Roswell, the guy that was there from Grants Pass with him, or before him, were about only two Americans, one other, I think, Americans that, mostly they were Scandinavian people, several Norwegians, several Swedes, one from Denmark, several from England, of course, and quite a few from Eastern, well, quite a few, two or three, from Eastern Canada, French. So this is a group. They probably were getting together for something like Dominion Day, which is their 4th of July, which is July 1st. And that's their big celebration. There's the school kids. My 2 neighbor girls up, they're pulling a wagon or pretending like they are. My sister's in the wagon, and Sonny Nichols is on the left, and I'm in the middle. And this would have been probably about 1940, 41, 42. Now, these are just kind of general pictures of the area to give you an idea how beautiful it is. That's called Skins Dome, and that's something that last year, my son and a couple of other people climbed it, and I did too, but that's my last time climbing that. That's pretty rugged. We climbed up on this side, but you get a beautiful view of the country there. So we do that. This is Parker Lake, which is one of the lakes my dad trapped on. Now this is the entrance that we go into the big lake, Utsa Lake. See the slot in the trees there? That's the entrance into Utsa Lake, which is about 40 miles long. And this was our little lake, which is about 10 acres or something like that. So we have good access out into the main lake. and it's a lot less wind back in here, so we have the best of all worlds that way. One problem they've had up there is this mountain pine beetle. It's like they have in eastern Oregon on jack pine or lodgepole pine, one and the same. But this is across from our lake, and it's taken with a telephoto lens. The mountains don't look that close, but there are 3 mountains in the background, beautiful mountains at 7,000 feet, so they have snow all year round. Then I got some animal pictures here. That's a cinnamon bear. Actually, it's a black bear that genetically became cinnamon for whatever reason. There is a species of bears called cinnamon, but this is a black bear, I'm told. I don't know. Fish and Wildlife said it was anyway. There's a wolf. This is amazing how close. My nephew took this picture, and he was on the road just down below it. But anytime I've ever seen a wolf, they are really skittish. The first look at you, they're gone. And why that was hanging around the road there, anyway, that was last summer. We took that. There's the moose. This was right across our lake. You see them quite frequently. Interesting, though, the moose didn't come into the area. And when my dad first got there, they had no sign of any moose in the country at all. But they'd had some big fires in the area, and apparently the change in habitat caused the moose to move in. And they love, they love willows and things like that, but they also love water plants. This is interesting. Now there's a big family. I don't think that goose would have laid all those eggs, but boy, there's a string of them there. Loons are really wonderful to hear. You know, they're kind of a wilderness bird. If you've been out somewhere, you've probably heard loons, but they call all the time. And this isn't a loon, of course, it's the bald eagle, but I didn't get a picture of a loon. Here's a couple of foxes and otters. And there's this beaver pond is up at the end of our lake. We're worried about it because last year the water was so high there were just a few sticks sticking out of the water, so we're not sure if they aren't going to move on, but we hope they're there this year. They've been there about 40 years. This is my nephew and a big fish he caught, about 10 pounds, 12 pounds, something like that. There me. I got a little over my limit there, but I think my nephews were helping me out, so. Hey, there's a crew. You recognize anybody there? I knew they wouldn't want me to take that picture, but Rochelle and Lois and Vicky, the Martinezzi sisters. Boy, you talk about, they are so competitive to one another that if you get them all 3 working on a project, man, do they get through it fast. So anyway, they were working here, helping me clear the ground. There's Lois last year. That isn't too flattering either, is it, honey? I took down the last 2, or my son rather did, the last 2 rooms to the old cabin. This is the same cabin that we looked at with my mother and dad standing in front of it, my sister and I sitting on the porch. So we removed the back part because it was leaning so bad we were afraid it would pull the whole thing over. So we wanted to save the historic building, which again would have been 1923. So it's going on over 90 years. There it is, it's just burning it's not as close as it appears to the old house. There's my new house now. See the mountains in the background. There's 3 mountains there that you can look right out of the living room or the upstairs bedroom, master bedroom on the other side. Here it is from the lake. You can see the 2 houses in relation to one another. 1930 on the left, or 1923, and 1997 on the right. Oh, one thing, reason I showed this is I guess I'm not much more patriotic than anybody, but I love both countries. And the first thing I do when I get there, well, the first thing I do is walk around the house because nobody's been there for maybe 3 or 4 months to see if any animals had got through the windows, broke a window or something. I wouldn't want to get caught in there with a hungry bear. But anyway, the second thing I do is put these flags out every year. And I'm proud to be a dual citizen.
Could you run for president?
Boy, I don't know. I've been thinking I couldn't. Now, maybe I can. You know, it's going to go to court. No, well, I was a little different, though. I was born up there to Canadian citizens. Both my parents had become citizens. They had to be citizens in order to prove up on the land, you know, to homestead. You had to be a citizen of the country. That's a beautiful shot. That's down at our other place, cattle. Now there's I keep harping at these guys. That's my nephew, my niece, myself, my daughter, and my son. And I keep harping on them that, you know, our heritage of Canada is now 105 years, will be this year. So they're going to be responsible for paying the taxes and keeping it going from now on. So they say they understand that, but who knows when I'm gone what's going to happen. Now this is something I saw from the New Yorker. You seem familiar, yet somehow strange. Are you by any chance Canadian? Well, thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy my talk about my dad and his experiences in British Columbia in 1912, when there were very, very few people in that area, and the ones that were there walked in 150 miles across an Indian trail in order to stake their claim to their 160 acres of land.